Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Meir. I'm the U.S. Executive Director for Humanity and Inclusion, and I'm also chair of the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines and the U.S. Cluster Munition Coalition. On behalf of all of us at the campaigns, we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. We have a terrific panel that will help you understand not only the President's announcement this past week about the U.S. policy on anti-personnel landmines, but why this matters and what you can do about it. The members of the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines include Amnesty International USA, the Arms Control Association, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Human Rights Watch, Legacies of War, Physicians for Human Rights, UNICEF USA, the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society, the West Virginia Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munitions, and Proud Students Against Landmines. Other members of the U.S. campaigns include dozens of organizations across the spectrum: religious, professional, military, diplomatic, human rights, and development and relief organizations. And we're very proud to offer this webinar today as a public service. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for attending. I'd like to turn the meeting over now to Ursula Knudsen-Latta, who is with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. So Ursula, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you for everyone for joining us this morning. And thank you for the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition for hosting this event. As many of you might have seen, this past Tuesday, President Biden announced a new anti-personnel landmine policy. This policy creates a near global ban on the use of these weapons and sets the goal of the U.S. eventually joining the Mine Ban Treaty. At the same time, the U.S. has not taken any meaningful steps to join the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and current U.S. policy on these weapons, adopted by the Trump administration in 2017, permits the U.S. military to use all of the millions of cluster munitions in our existing stockpiles until so-called enhanced and more reliable versions are developed. But before we dig into the weeds of these policies and discuss the politics behind it, where this new policy might strengthen safeguards, fall short, and what future U.S. policy with respect to landmines and cluster munitions should look like, I want to begin with the human side and the human impact of these weapons. So it's my pleasure to introduce Bhutan Pumasit. Bhutan is a co-founder of the Lao Mutual Assistance Association, a nonprofit organization that was established in 1984, where she helps to find and mobilize assets in the community. She began her professional career as a social worker in Ohio, where she gained experience working with local governments and assisting refugees from Southeast Asia on their resettlement process and adjusting to American culture and systems. She was born in Laos in 1957 during the American Secret War and fled to the US in 1979. As the survivor of the bombing, she volunteers with Legacies of War, an organization dedicated to raising awareness about Vietnam War era bombing in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and advocates for the clearance of unexploded UXO. She's a survivor assistance, and to provide space for healing the wounds of war and to create hope for the future. Bhutan, we would love for you to share your story with us. Over to you.
Sabadi. My name is Bhutan Pumasit. Thank you for the U.S. Cluster Bomb Landmine Commission or members for organizing today's discussion, and thank you for the Legacy of War for extension the invitation to me to be part of it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, as I often feel that the story of refugees like myself and those left behind from the American secret war in Laos are forgotten, despite it still being an issue until today. I know from firsthand experience that the destruction that was caused then, now, and will continue to cause in the future. My life experience since I was born, I feel like that. But when I was 3 years old, myself and my family experienced General Gong Lei coup, and then extended to that, lo and behold, there was a lot of T-28s flew over the skies and dropping bombs into our village and many other villages that destroyed homes, farms, animals, people, mainly young until old, tremendously. So when I was young, I saw this, and we escaped from one village to another. Just like in Ukraine right now, the people felt like if they moved from this village or this town or city, and they would be safe in another city. And we were exactly like that that they experience today. Except for we were hiding in the caves for several months. You know, at times that I was in school in the northern part of Laos, because of the T-28 flew up on our head. Once we heard that, our parents or the teachers will make sure that drag us into the bomb shelters underneath of our house or underneath of the school. It was an awful experience. We never have time to rest or to be out in the field working as we need to, because the bomb trampling down. We were afraid to be killed. So therefore, we were in the bomb shelter most of the time. Only the adults went out to seeking food and rice for little bed, so that we can survive for many months and years. Until 1969, that I remember clearly, that there was bomb coming down, there's people died in front of us, there was injured, the civilians injured, and the militaries injured, because we were like at the max at that time, because it was chaos after the Vietnamese troops surrounding the country, surrounding especially the province that we were staying at. So it was, my story was, you know, I would say, when did we get a break from the aircraft flying over our head? And when I look back, there was never time, because it was since 1964 to 1973, the US bomb dropped over 2.5 million tons of bombs on Laos during 580,000 bombs missions that equal to plane load of bombs. every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day. For 9 years, 9 straight years, it earned Laos the title of most bombed country per capita in history. In addition to cluster bomb landmines and other explosives were used on Laos, the US was not at war with Laos. This was all part of the efforts to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes to the south during Vietnam War. The people of Laos become collateral damage. I am one of these people. Thousands of people were killed and maimed right in front of me. I remember escaping the dead of the night and on the boat with our kids, our 4-month-old son and 18-month-old son, praying that we won't be seen as a moving toward to avoid a bomb. We were lucky, unlike the lifeless bodies that floated by us during the at the Mekong River. I share my story in hopes that we can learn from the history of the American Secret War. I hope that we don't have war in Ukraine, that we don't have to be involved in this level. The US decision to drop bombs 50 years ago still impacts the lives of children and many families today. The experience that I had fleeing still traumatized my life, my family, and especially myself. Bombs that were dropped and landmines that were planted will continue to kill, harm, unless we remove them. And we need to move them soon before the landmine kills everyone. The landmines will cut off the legs and the arms, and perhaps, unfortunately, if hit, people will be gone instantly. I'm happy to see the new landmines policy, as mentioned earlier. And it was a huge change. I urge President Biden and Congress to please take bolder action. Join the Mine Ban Treaty and Convention on Cluster Bomb Munition. Show that American value life over profit. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be glad to share my experience, to share my little bombing story that I have experienced and never have gone away from my head. I thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing that. I know it's a difficult story for you to share, but it's such an important one. As our speakers are speaking today, you can go ahead and put questions in the Q&A function. We're going to have one more speaker and then take a couple questions, if there are any, before moving to our final 3 panelists. So I'd now like to introduce Mike. Mike Burton was commissioned in the U.S. Air Force in 1962 and spent the early years of his Air Force career in special operations. He was assigned to the 56th Air Commando Wing in Thailand, and in 1966, as the U.S. was building up its bombing missions in Laos. The 56th was heavily involved in the interdiction warfare against the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laos. Mike served in the Oregon legislature for 5 terms and was elected as executive officer for the Portland Metropolitan Government, serving from 1995 to 2003. Before retiring, his last position was as vice provost of Portland State University. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Ursula, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. I appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to also thank the Biden administration for making the changes to the U.S. anti-personnel landmine policy, but as Una mentioned, it doesn't quite go far enough, and the connection between landmines and cluster bombs is something I'd like to try to explain. As was mentioned, I was assigned to a base that was considered the most secret of the bases in the secret war, and over there, the unit that I was with flew T-28s, A-26s, and A-1s, all of which were assigned to do interdiction on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But also, we were tasked to support the special guerrilla units of the Royal Lao Army, which was under General Vang Pao, in their land operations. So we did both interdiction and we did close air support for those units. We carried lots of weapons. The aircraft had machine guns, rockets, bombs, both conventional and cluster bombs. And I think they're going to put something in the chat room that sort of shows you what a cluster bomb looks like. They look like any other bomb. They're cylinder based on the outside, but they're quite different on the inside. Let me just explain one type that we use that was used quite a bit, and that is a cluster bomb unit 24. The bomb casing would hold about 665 small bomblets, little things that look like baseball bats or baseballs rather, and had some little fins on them. But what would happen is above the ground, as the aircraft went in, we would drop the primary CBU, which would then open and spread these little bomblets indiscriminately wherever we were trying to hit. We didn't aim at trucks with those, although occasionally that would happen. They were mostly used for ground support. However, in some cases, when you would have a problem with the aircraft, for instance, if you had a hydraulic issue with the aircraft, which happened a lot, these are all prop-driven aircraft, you didn't want to land with those bombs hanging on your wings, so you would try to release them before you landed, and that's where a lot of indiscriminate bombing occurred. And if you look at a map of the bombing of Laos from north to south, you'll see a spread of the bombs that were dropped that's just unbelievable. Those bombs would be timed, some of them, to explode later, so they were intentionally on delayed exposure. The idea there was to deny the enemy the opportunity to get into an area or to try to recover. In some cases, they're wounded, just keep them out of an area. So these bombs would be spread all over the place. And you can imagine 665 of them, a T-28 could carry 2 of those. So you had over 13,000 1,300 rather small bomblets that spread all over the place. What they do with those small bombs, if they hit and exploded right away, they exploded shrapnel. There are 2 casings there, an outside and inside, and they would explode and spread the shrapnel out. In some cases, they were purposely timed to not go off right away, and they would bury themselves in the ground and not explode. And what we found over the years is those little cluster bombs or bomblets or bombies still exist. They're metal. They have a long lifetime. They're not like some landmines that are plastic and last forever, but these things will last a long time. So 50 years later, we found that some people will find these in the trees that have grown up, literally, or buried in the ground. I'll give you an example of one thing that happened to me on a mission I was on. We were asked to land at a Lima site. These are short takeoff and landing sites that we had all over Laos, which were recovery sites in case of an emergency for aircraft or as a waiting position for sending aircraft up in case somebody in bombing Hanoi came back and needed to be recovered or saved. We were called into this site, at a Lima site, and because they said there was a medical emergency, and we landed we found that there was a 8 to 10-year-old boy who had found one of these bombs. This is during the war. Picked it up, I assume, thinking it was a toy, and it blew his left arm off just above the elbow. Blew part of his hand off. I'd say he had 2 fingers left. One eye was missing, and he had a lot of facial wounds. There's no medical facilities in those villages. There still aren't in a lot of the villages. There's no place to take this child. They had wrapped some cloth around the wounds as best they could and wanted us to take him to some medical facility, the closest ones were in Thailand. I vacated my seat and we put him in the plane, and they flew off. Unfortunately, he died on the way there. This is a 9-year-old, 10-year-old who simply went out to the field either to work or to play and found one of these things. Since the war started, over 50,000 individuals up to today have been killed or wounded as a result of these cluster bombs. Essentially, they are airborne landmines. That's the connection. They no matter what you call it, cluster bombs, they're airborne and air delivered landmines. They're still there. The number is almost uncountable. I heard it's up to 80 million of these that may still be laying around all through that country. It denies that nation the economic ability to use part of their land, let alone causing the death and destruction from the direct use of the US's munitions in what was a violation of international treaty in the first place. We didn't adhere to the 1962 Geneva Accord. The US ignored that, so did the North Vietnamese. But we have to assume a great deal of responsibility for the destruction that's happened and the terrible situation that still occurs because of these airborne landmines that exist in Laos. This war has not ended. Everybody says, well, the war is over with. No, it's not. The war is not over with. Just as if the Ukraine situation gets resolved and the direct shooting starts, the war won't have ended there because there will still be landmines and cluster bombs in that country. And these wars will go on, and the war in Laos continues to go on. And hopefully the United States will address the question, will sign a treaty against the use of cluster bombs being manufactured, made, and provided by the United States, and provide the funds that we need you to go back in and help that country clean up the mess that we left there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate sort of having the many sides of the story here today. As I mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. Bhutan will be able to stay through to the full Q&A section, and Mike will have to leave us a little bit early, or Mike can stay. Great. If you think of questions for them, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A as we go. But I'm going to turn to our second set of panelists with deep gratitude for Bhutan and Mike for beginning us with sort of this human side of the impact as we dig into more of the policy and politics surrounding these weapons. So first, I'd like to introduce Ben Rhodes, who is a Legacy of War board member. He was the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting from 2009 to 2017 under President Obama. During his tenure, Ben participated in all of President Obama's key decisions and oversaw the president's national security communications, speechwriting, and public diplomacy. He spearheaded initiatives to help President Obama engage with countries like Laos in the hopes of fostering good relations, development, and human rights. He is currently a writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He resides in LA with his wife and 2 daughters and has a BA from Rice and an MFA from NYU. I'm also going to introduce Mary Warham, Advocacy Director of the Arms Division of the Human Rights Watch. She works to advance humanitarian disarmament and enhance protections for civilians from various weapons that inflict unnecessary harm. She coordinates the campaign to stop killer robots she coordinated the campaign to stop killer robots from its inception until March 2021. As Advocacy Director for Oxfam New Zealand from 2006 to 2008, she contributed to the adoption of the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. She coordinated the Landmine Monitor Research Initiative to verify implementation of the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty, and worked with Jody Williams in coordinating the international campaign to ban landmines, and is a co-laureate of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize. Rachel Stoll is our third panelist. Rachel is Vice President of Research Programs at Stimson Center and the Director of the Conventional Defense Program. Prior to joining Stimson, Stoll was an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs from 2009 to 2011. She was a Senior Analyst at the Center for Defense Information from 1998 to 2009, and she consulted with the UN during the Arms Trade Treaty process from 2010 to 2013, and was previously a consultant to the UN Group of Governmental Experts on the Arms Trade Treaty in 2008, and the UN Register for Conventional Arms in 2009. So we have a fantastic group of experts on these issues. Thank you all for joining us. Rachel, I'm going to kick off with a question for you. Can you give us just some background on the recent actions by the administration related to landmines?
Sure. Thank you, Ursula, and thanks to the U.S. campaign to ban landmines for sponsoring. I think this is the first conversation about the new landmine policy, so it's great to sort of kick off a much needed dialogue on this topic. I think this new policy is a very long time coming. We've been patiently waiting since the Biden administration announced they were undertaking a comprehensive review of U.S. anti-personnel landmines policy in April 2021. So it took us quite a long time to get here, but I'm glad to see that common sense has prevailed and that at the very least, we've gone back to where we were at the end of the Obama administration and with the Obama administration's policy announcements in 2014. It is it's notable that we have this new policy. It's great to see the United States sort of back on track where it was 8 years ago. But it is just a first step. And of course, we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't encourage more and more action towards eventually joining the Mine Ban Treaty and removing the Korea exception. So I do want to look a little bit backwards to get us to where we are. I've heard Mary say many times, this is the 7th new landmine policy since 1996. It's great that we are evolving in our thinking, but sometimes it seems as though we're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and there's still many steps to go. It's good we're on a forward step. So I want to acknowledge that it's really important that the U.S. is not only adopting a more appropriate and responsible landmine policy, but also that the U.S. is returning to some of the legitimacy and credibility that it had in this space in terms of its great work on humanitarian demining that was sort of lost by the last administration. And when I'm talking about what the Trump administration did, if you look back to January 2020, the Trump administration released a new U.S. anti-personnel landmine policy that really was a complete reverse course of where we had been. It allowed both the production and use of anti-personnel landmines for future conflicts and really rolled back decades of U.S. practice and approach, which in our minds really put the United States at risk, put U.S. Service members at risk, and really, as we've heard, put civilians around the globe at risk. The Obama policy and sort of where we've ended up again today is that the U.S. will no longer produce, acquire, or replace anti-personnel landmines. And that's really important because in 2014, in September 2014, the Obama administration announced that not only would the United States not use anti-personnel landmines anywhere in the world except for the Korean Peninsula, it also pledged, again, outside of that Korea exception, and we'll talk about that, not to assist or otherwise encourage other countries to engage in activities prohibited by the Mine Ban Treaty, and to destroy landmine stocks not required for the defense of South Korea. Again, that Korea exception. That's really important, right? It's embracing the norm that most of the rest of the world has has embraced. And by doing so in this 2014 policy, the United States announced that it would work towards US accession to the International Mine Ban Treaty, which is a long time goal, not only of the US campaign, but of civilians and activists and advocates around the world. The Trump administration policy sort of was a slap in the face to all of that work that had been done over those many decades. And really, when it allowed the use of non-persistent landmines, so those that have self-destruct or self-deactivation mechanisms in any area that was not limited by geographic location, what it meant in practice was the US actually could use landmines if combatant commanders decided it was in the US interest in any area where they're deemed necessary. And that was a very unfortunate result of that policy. I think we also are very aware at this point that the Trump administration's characterization of mines as non-persistent is artificial. We just heard about the persistence of clusters and landmines around the world. And of course, in the field, we know that anti-personnel landmines cannot distinguish between a soldier and a civilian and an adult or a child. And it doesn't matter if a mine does self-destruct in less than a month or in a few days, because while they're active, they're deadly to whoever comes into contact with them. I'd also like to say that the Trump administration's policy was really out of step with both international norms and also with sort of US common practice. So we know that 164 nations have ratified the Mine Ban Treaty, which prohibits the stockpiling, production, transfer, and use of landmines of anti-personnel landmines in all circumstances. And that, again, that Korea exception is sort of this blockage that the United States has. And we know that the utility of these weapons has really not been needed by the United States. In the last 30 years, the United States has undertaken numerous operations without using anti-personnel landmines. In fact, they last deployed them in Iraq and Kuwait in 1991. And there's only been one exception for a single anti-personnel mine in Afghanistan in 2002. So these are not something that are regularly used in the US arsenal. And it's certainly time, as I think this new Biden administration policy demonstrates, to return towards that progress, towards joining the treaty and getting rid of the Korea exception. It's a little surprising that it took the Biden administration a year and a few months to figure out we needed to go back to where we started. But let me just say this is a great first step. And I look forward to continuing to work with the US government and other interested stakeholders because we're in a better place today to go back to the serious work necessitated by these indiscriminate weapons. And so I'm very pleased to see this new announcement this week. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Ursula.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I think that really gives us a grounding in where we're at on the landmine policy. And Mary, can you tell us a little bit more about why this policy contains this geographic exception that Rachel was just mentioning for the Korean Peninsula?
Sure thing. And thanks, Rachel, for recapping what's happened. The US has indeed put itself back on the track to eliminating anti-personnel landmines, but in the view of my organization, Human Rights Watch, and the campaign, greater ambition is needed to get there sooner. And the last remaining problem now is for the US to accept that the international ban on anti-personnel landmines applies in all circumstances and in all locations. There is no geographic exception in the international treaty. And so in order for the United States to join, it's going to have to remove the exception for allowing it to use anti-personnel landmines on the Korean Peninsula. The wording that the US uses surrounding Korea hasn't really changed over the decades. There are unique circumstances on the Korean Peninsula that preclude the US from changing its policy on landmines there at this time. You know, the security of the Republic of Korea is of paramount concern. These are the words that we hear. And kind of what it boils down to is two specific issues. One is the arrangement for the joint command structure in the event of war with North Korea. At the moment, that would put a US general in operational control of the response by the South Korean military forces. And that directly conflicts with the international treaty's prohibition on any assistance with the use of anti-personnel landmines if the US general were to participate in that kind of decision making. We have to say that the future command structure for the Korean Peninsula was agreed back in 2007, and that will put a South Korean general in charge of the response of their own forces during wartime. That still hasn't been implemented yet, and I think there's challenges to doing that can be easily overcome. The other aspect of the Korea exception is the possible need for the US to itself use anti-personnel landmines, as part of the defense in case of an event of an invasion by North Korean forces. Just to respond on this, for years, we've said that there's no compelling justification for the United States to use landmines on the Korean Peninsula, and many agree with that. There have been numerous retired military officers, including former commanders of US forces in Korea, who question the need for this exception. And I think, as Rachel mentioned, for the past 30 years, the United States has fought without anti-personnel landmines. It has the alternative strategies, the alternative tactics, the alternative weaponry available to it without having to resort to anti-personnel landmines. I want to acknowledge something that Bonnie Jenkins, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, said when she was releasing the policy with Stan Brown this week. And she said that the policy is centered around people, around communities, and around individuals around the world who seek peace and security. I think it's been really notable that the people who rolled out this policy announcement, Stan Brown is heading up the mine clearance support that the United States gives around the world. And many people hear this number of $4.2 billion that the United States has spent on mine clearance efforts in more than 30 countries around the world since 1993. So over the past 30 years, 3 decades, that's a really significant sum if you're a mine clearance organization, but it pales in comparison to US military spending. We see the weapons that are being shipped over at the moment, and there's certainly that much. It also, if you can contrast it with what it costs for the United States to keep the US military presence in South Korea, that costs at least $4.4 billion a year. So I think as part of this whole effort, and as Buntan and Mike mentioned at the beginning, there needs to be, I think, increased support from the United States to mine clearance activities and to the clearance of cluster munition remnants around the world. But I like the grounding of this policy in humanitarian terms, and that's why the Korea exception needs to be approached from that perspective and from the view of civil society. There's an active Korea campaign to ban landmines in South Korea, which has documented how farmers and other civilians have been maimed and killed by landmines that have fallen out of the DMC, the demilitarized zone, and landed in rivers and then ended up in agricultural areas. I've met US soldiers, one who was only 18, who was blown up by a landmine in the DMZ and recovering at Walter Reed Hospital with one leg, saying we had no idea where the anti-personnel landmines were in the DMZ. There are so many there that have been laid over the years. It's like lasagna. And so they're harming US soldiers as well as South Korean soldiers. Korea Peace Now, Christian Ahn, she has said that the landmines in the DMZ are not going to save South Korea from an invasion by the North. They only endanger South Koreans and US forces there. So I also saw Dan Jasper from AFSC talking about how archaic the Korean exception sounds, how it has colonial overtones, and how it's something that really needs to be addressed now in the coming period. But the big thing is that we're back in 2014 with a policy that has been applauded literally when the US made the announcement this week at the Mine Ban Treaty. I've been looking for any negative reactions, and it's extremely hard to find one. I looked at the White House transcript from the press briefing that they did. They were happy to talk about landmines, and the reporters had no questions, which I think shows you how uncontroversial this decision has been, and it also signposts quite clearly where we've got to get to now in the coming period. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. And I wanted to turn it over to you, Ben, just to ask, Where does current U.S. policy fall short on cluster munitions? You know, we've heard some great things about this new landmine policy, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit about current U.S. policy on cluster munitions.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for having me here. As someone who's a part of the discussions about the 2014 policy and around cluster munitions, there's a bit of deja vu, because as has been said, we went back to where we were, and essentially on both landmines and cluster munitions, I think there's a presumption when you have rational administrations, I'm excluding the Trump administration, that we just don't use them anymore, right? So that therefore, the impediment to kind of joining more formal treaty-based obligations on cluster munitions is actually quite similar to the impediment on landmines. It has a lot to do with Korea. Because what you'll hear is, well, the U.S. hasn't really used cluster munitions since Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, within one exception in Yemen, in the same way that we don't use anti-personnel landmines. And the reason to not kind of formalize that constraint is usually the opposition comes from within the Pentagon. And basically, it would involve a revision of their war plans, particularly as it relates to Korea and the Korean Peninsula. I don't agree with this, by the way. Just I'm explaining it. I think military commanders like to have the flexibility to plan for different contingencies, and in the Korea case in particular, these war plans go back decades and rely on weaponry that the United States has fought other wars and not utilized. And so to me, it's a self-imposed objection rooted in just a lack of imagination in terms of adapting and evolving and updating war plans and being able to kind of universalize a constraint. I think there are other aspects to it. One, there is a significant arms industry in the United States that manufactures these types of weapons. And so they have influence that they bring to bear. And then there's on the right in the United States, obviously just a complete opposition to any internationalized constraint on the US military. I think that the Trump administration's kind of radical pivot, however, speaks to precisely why you want to consolidate and as best you can make binding constraints on the United States. Now, ratifying treaties, one of the things, I think there's a defeatism that it's crept in for somewhat understandable reasons. In the course of the Obama years, the capacity to ratify any treaty kind of went out the door. We did ratify the New START arms control treaty in 2010, which feels like from a different era. We tried to ratify what seemed to be the least controversial treaty imaginable, which is the treaty related to disabilities with a lot of Republican support, including from Bob Dole, and that got voted down. So I think that the kind of complete obstacle, the kind of blanket opposition to joining any international convention and ratifying any treaty kind of makes U.S. policymakers, even who are sympathetic to that, think this isn't worth it. We have bans in practice. That's the best we can do. Even with, and then you obviously have this Korea exception on top of it in the landmine case. And again, I think that's probably the most prominent obstacle to cluster munitions as well. I guess I would argue that, again, we've seen that you want to put in place the strictest restrictions possible, in part to guard against future administrations, but also right now, we're in a scenario in Ukraine where Russia is deploying both cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. And our capacity to have to speak with total moral and legal clarity on these issues is compromised, because we ourselves are not party to the kind of binding restrictions that we are now accusing Russia of violating in Ukraine, right? And so, to me, like there's this, you know, as has been said, like the appropriate steps being taken are essentially U.S. guidelines imposing restrictions on what we will do. And I think with cluster munitions, we should formalize that in the same way that we formalized the landmine policy last week. That's the first step. The next half step is universalizing that, so not carving out Korea. But then I think it's going to be a much longer haul to try to kind of reverse the kind of defeatism around the capacity for the United States to join an international convention. And look, you know, that's not going to change in the next year or two. But I mean, that's why the kind of people who are on this webinar are important, because you have to kind of keep making the case and wait for the moment when something might shift where you can move more forcefully in that direction. So, so I'd like to see the cluster munitions policy be brought kind of in line with where we are in landmines. I think, again, the reasons that they aren't are quite simply that, well, we think to ourselves, we don't use them anyway, and we'll get pushback from DoD, and we'd have to revise contingency planning. But that's the next step. I hope that work is being done as we speak.
Thank you. And that ties nicely into a question I had for Mary about how this new U.S. landmine policy can positively influence the other non-signatories, including China and Russia, on landmines, I should say.
Sure thing. I think something notable about this new policy is that the officials have been stressing Biden's belief that the US must work to curtail and to reduce the use of landmines worldwide. And there was a really big effort when the announcement was made to kind of show how it stands in stark contrast to the actions of Russia in Ukraine. The use by Russian forces of anti-personnel landmines, at least 7 types we've counted, as well as the use of a similar number of types of cluster munitions by Russian forces. The US wants to be seen as the opposite of what Russia is doing in this regard. And you know, I think that that very kind of pledge will help us. It should help steel the resolve of the Ukrainians not to violate the mine ban treaty, which they have signed, and to ensure that they do not use anti-personnel landmines. And we do not have evidence that that is the case. Both sides are using anti-vehicle mines, which are not prohibited. There's been one instance of the Ukrainians using cluster munitions, and that has been pointed out quite clearly, and we haven't seen much more evidence since then. So that's good, and I hope that the US can use its influence there. It's also helped to clarify, you know, if landmines are being transferred, they're not to Ukraine, or the types that have been are not prohibited by the convention. And we'll see what Russia does in response to the new landmine policy. But on both landmines and on cluster munitions, I think they are the #1 bad country engaging in new production, and of course engaging in use. China's quite different. China likes to come to the treaty meetings, to participate, to talk about the humanitarian benefits of dealing with landmines and all the clearance that it's doing. But because China hasn't taken the same kind of steps to align its own policy and practice with the prohibitions contained in the treaty like the US has, there'll be a bit of positive competition there. I think China will now be looking at what it can do to kind of look better than the United States on this. I mentioned earlier the applause at the Mine Ban Treaty meeting, the kind of universal support that has been given to the US policy announcement. And I guess this is maybe an opportunity just to talk about the difference on landmines and on cluster munitions. One thing that the Obama administration did well back in 2009, there was a botched policy announcement, but it did lead to the US participating in the landmine treaty meetings as an observer. And I remember the first day when they showed up to that mine ban treaty meeting, how terrified these US officials looked. They thought that they were going to be, you know, eggs thrown at them as soon as they walked in the room. And I hope and I know that they felt happy about the response, that it was, again, not a controversial thing, that this is a friendly community of states and that this fits with all of the clearance work that they've done. So there's only 32 countries in the world that have not yet banned anti-personnel landmines. I'm not sure if the US can have influence over all of them. It certainly could have influence over the Marshall Islands and Micronesia, who've been waiting for the United States to do the right thing on this. There are Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others who have not yet joined the mine ban treaty, and some in Asia as well, important countries for us anyway, including India, Pakistan, and Vietnam. So we hope that the US will kind of use this platform positively. And I think coming back to the kind of humanitarian framing of the announcement, yeah, no, sorry, I won't because that'll take too long. I'm just going to leave it there. Thanks, Ursula.
Thanks so much, Mary. And thank you, Jens, for putting a question in the Q&A. Please, to everyone in the audience, feel free to ask any questions you have. You can ask them anonymously if you wouldn't like to be associated with your question. That's totally fine. But before we go to Jens' question, I did want to ask Ben, you know, based on your experiences in the Obama administration and the deliberations and the process that they went through on cluster munitions and landmines, what lessons can the Biden administration learn to take action on these as they go through their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the principal lesson, I guess, is that the constituency inside of the administration that is always going to be resistant to these types of changes is the Pentagon. But I don't mean to set them out as like the bad guys. I mean, like their job is to plan as many different ways as possible to win wars. And the reason you have civilian control is, you know, to have civilians who say, well, like, let's try to find different ways of doing that that they can fall in line with these international standards and for these reasons. And so I think the principal lesson is, you know, not to be afraid of, you know, what are sometimes somewhat difficult conversations, to know who are the allies and advocates for these changes. And what can be very important is to make sure that those voices are heard in internal debates. So in other words, you know, oftentimes when you're trying to make changes like this, people who are, you know, on the armed services committees or people who are close to the military perspective, you know, they'll make their voices heard at the White House and in other places. And even though, as has been noted, these aren't hugely controversial, they seem more controversial than they are because of the pushback that you get. And I do think the arms manufacturers are also a part of that. And so to that end, part of what's been important in the progress that's been made on these issues is having congressional champions for these actions. I think another lesson I would learn, though, is that hearing from allied foreign governments can also be quite helpful. You know, NATO allies and others weighing in about the value of the United States taking a different approach. That, you know, that at a time when, for instance, now, part of what we're really trying to center our foreign policy around is the kind of consolidation of NATO and the unity within NATO. And NATO is kind of the anchor of the security anchor of a rules-based order. That strikes me as a time in which, you know, NATO members making it known that it would be of value for the United States to take these steps and to lead by example could be a helpful dimension to have inside these rooms. Because, you know, you have the outside advocates, and that's important, you know, to hold people accountable and to push for the most aggressive action. And the development community, the human rights community, the arms control community, frankly, the people represented on this call are important sources of pressure and validation, by the way. It's important, for an administration to feel like, that someone is going to tell them that was a welcome step, and that their voters who care about this and their constituencies who care about this. And, as I was fighting to get funding for UXO clearance in Laos, the constituency that involved Vietnam veterans, as well as diaspora populations, was incredibly important, because those are real voters. Those are people who politicians and political leaders have to pay attention to. So the principal lesson I have is just know if you want to make a change, or you're sympathetic to making a change, know the constellation of actors and stakeholders who are on your side, and make sure that you're mobilizing them, you're listening to them, you're connecting them to the people that are the holdouts to change, and that suddenly makes the spectrum of what's possible seem bigger, and it makes the reward for taking a step seem greater, and it makes it such that the opponents of change are not the ones who are the only ones who are kind of really putting their shoulders to the wheel in internal debates.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And speaking of NATO and NATO allies, I did want to quickly ask Jens' question from the United Nations Association of Sweden, a new potential NATO ally. And thank you so much for your support from the UNA Association of Sweden under the Trump administration, where you mentioned you guys brought 4,500 signatures in support of the Mine Ban Treaty to our embassy. But he's asking, how large is the US landmine stockpile, and is there a timeline for its destruction? And I'm going to ask that of Rachel.
Sure, and Mary can correct me if there's more updated information than I have. And I also, can I start by just responding a little bit to what Ben said also, because I think at the end of the day, what I'd like to see from the Biden administration or any US president is really courage and the ability to do what is right because it's the right thing to do. In this case, this is an easy one, right? This is one where you have global support, and so you can take sort of the easy win. And yes, there's always going to be constituencies and stakeholders that have an opposite view. We're seeing that play out in so many issues in Washington right now. But I think for many of us who've worked on this issue for several decades, it's exhausting to, be thrilled about something that we already had 8 years ago, right? Like, I would like to be excited about the next step in this discussion and in this evolution of US policy. And so while I'm grateful that common sense has gotten us back to where we were 8 years ago, there's still so much more that we can do to get in step with the rest of the world. And again, in this case, just having the courage to do what's right and what will save lives in the end, I think is really important. I think it actually goes to the question that you just asked, Ursula, which is about the stockpile, because if you look at the policy announced on Tuesday, it says the US is committed to destroying stockpiles outside those that would be needed to defend Korea. In 2014, the US said it had 3 million landmines in its stockpile. It also said that many of those weapons would be obsolete by 2030. They would no longer be operational. But then in the 2020 Trump policy, you had them say, we're going to keep those stockpiles, retain them so that we can use them if necessary. So it's a little bit difficult to ascertain really how many continue to exist and that are usable in the stockpile today. But more importantly, what this policy doesn't include is sort of that timetable for discussion or for destruction, the numbers that they hope to destroy at the end, say, of each of the milestones in that timetable. So certainly we welcome additional clarity about this US stockpile, where it stands today, what the plans are for the eventual destruction, and how many are envisioned that would be necessary while we are still trying to eliminate this Korea exception. How many would be necessary to be kept under that exception.
Thanks so much. And Mary, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just to say that I saw that the Stan Brown was asked about the stockpile numbers, and he gave the same number as was given back in 2014 of about 3 million anti-personnel landmines. And the point about the 2014 announcement was the acquisition, no more acquisition, and letting the stockpile basically run down. Most weapons will expire over time. And for the US landmine stocks, they've got batteries that expire, right? And so there was a quote from a defense official back in 2014 saying that the existing landmine stocks will start to decline in their ability to be used in about 10 years time, right? 2024. 10 years after that, they'll be completely unusable. So I think the stockpile destruction is happening. There's just not transparency around it, and questions need to be asked both congressionally and through other processes. But the main thing is that the stocks are not operational, that they have been slated for destruction. The operational stocks would be what's needed for use in Korea. So there's not much transparency there. There is also the concern that there may be continued production, but the United States gave up production in 1997. And to be honest, we haven't seen a lot of defense contractors clamoring to start production again under Trump. That it just didn't happen. It didn't happen because of many reasons, but because there's an awareness, I think, even amongst the defense manufacturers, that there are international treaties. There is stigma against certain weapons. There are disinvestment campaigns urging financial institutions not to invest in the production of banned weapons. And those things have paid off over the years. They've really helped to reinforce the stigma against them. And the same thing happened with cluster munitions. 2016, the last US manufacturer of cluster munitions said, "I've had it, we're getting out of this business, it's too much trouble." So they basically ended that production line and kept all of their other ones. So it's a kind of, I guess, another thing about the incremental gains that you make, the steps to align with the policy, that also comes from pressure outside that doesn't relent when you have the framework for achieving your goal of a mine-free world. And our framework is the Mine Ban Treaty, and others have that on other concerns.
I just want to say that that's a really good point. Remember when that happened, when the U.S. halted delivery of certain munitions to Saudi Arabia after they used cluster munitions in Yemen. I remember the manufacturer halting. I do think I do think that as a general matter, maybe I'm a bit of a cynic about the arms manufacturers, but they don't like to see the U.S. joining, even if they're not producing the weapons. They're generally opposed to the U.S. joining these kinds of restrictive conventions. However, you make a really good point, Mary, that the more, even in the absence of the U.S. being in like a formal party to some of these international conventions, the more the stigma itself is just strengthened. That does become an impediment to things like manufacturing, and that's really important. That shows you that even as we are falling short of the ideal that I think everybody who's obviously participating in this webinar want to see, you make real progress by amplifying the stigma itself, and so that speaks to the value of pushing on this and spotlighting it. And I think that's been in Ukraine. That's a utility of spotlighting the use of cluster munitions and landmines as kind of part of the picture of Russia's indiscriminate use of violence. That in and of itself will also further strengthen the stigma and create incentives really for the U.S. to move away from even the consideration of those kinds of weapons.
Thanks. And I do just want to once again invite our attendees, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. If you have questions for anyone, any of our 5 panelists, we'd appreciate them. So we do have a question in the Q&A for Ben. What more can the U.S. campaigns, as well as other civil society organizations, do to inspire the Biden administration to publish a clear timeline on acceding to the Mine Ban Treaty and Cluster Munitions Convention?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what part of what is so helpful is when, the outside groups basically draw up your plan for you. There actually is, as big as the U.S. government is, like sometimes there is a bandwidth issue, and so I think being as specific as possible about what is that roadmap and how much you get there, and here's why. So because part of the value of activism is highlighting the cost and this, and like we said, the stigma. And I think that the efforts in the last 20 years around legacy of war issues, and I'm on the board of Legacies of War, but around the unexploded ordnance in Laos, and even around and these are different weapons, obviously, but Agent Orange in Vietnam, it created a certain kind of momentum to meet a moral obligation, both to clear unexploded ordnance, but also to accelerate efforts to change U.S. policies. That's one kind of pressure. But then the other kind of advocacy that can be quite helpful is, okay, you say you want to be on a pathway to join. Well, here's what that pathway looks like. Here's what, here's how you can get there. Here's why your Korea exception doesn't make sense. And that can both, take away an argument to not do something, and it can potentially also offer what could become an applicable roadmap to get somewhere, right? So I think that's a good place to focus efforts too. But I just want to associate myself with Rachel's remarks, like, should be done because it's the right thing to do. That is like the baseline. Absolutely. But I do think, the hand-holding and the shining a flashlight on here's that pathway you can walk can be helpful too.
Thanks so much. Rachel or Mary, anything you'd like to add? Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one timeline goal could be for the United States to accede to the Mine Ban Treaty by its historic fifth review conference, which will be, I think, in 2014. The last one was hosted by Norway in 2019. These are 5-yearly review conferences. They're major milestones for the convention that gives a couple of years to sort out the Korea exception. And I think everybody needs to work on the Korea exception now. And we need to find voices and bring voices to the fore from Korean Americans who can explain this, and the Korean government themselves, right? Because the Korean government said that they haven't used anti-personnel landmines for years besides what's in the DMZ, and they go to great pains to talk about the clearance that is happening, the victim assistance support that's happening. And if North Korean soldiers are found to be using anti-personnel landmines in the DMZ, South Korea gets furious about it because of the potential for harm to their own soldiers, but also because these are such dastardly weapons, right? So I'd like to hear a bit more from the South Korean government on this whole exception that the US has thrown in the way, because I think we really could overcome it. Thanks.
I'd just like to say, Ursula, I think it's a real testament that, Ben, Mary, and I have been in Washington for a very long time. And the fact that we are still committed, and I'm going to say I was idealistic. I mean, when I talk about courage, right, I get that that's a little bit of idealism coming through, but I do think that this is such an achievable goal. I mean, Mary just put a date of 2020. It's 2 years from now. If I understood you correctly, it's 2 years from now to see, this influx of progress. And I think that in many cases, we've seen the power of voices of civil society, of our allies, of all of the stakeholders that Ben went through as necessary to this experience, really, coming together around this common purpose. And we're getting closer, right? We're back to sort of a reasonable approach. We're back to a single exception. And so it's sort of like we can just sort of see that goal over the horizon, and we know that there hasn't been acquisition. We know the stockpile is, running out of batteries as we go. Let's be forward looking and push this administration, push Congress, push our policymakers to really demand action before the next presidential election. Because I think if anything, the previous administration showed us that when you think that you've made 30 years of progress, it's very easily to quickly undermine and reverse course on all of the progress that had been made. And so I'd like to see, really not only concrete steps taken in the next 2 years, but steps that really make it impossible to reverse where the United States is heading, and that we do not only eliminate the Korea exception, but we're able to join the Mine Ban Treaty.
I want to say one more thing too, because these are both really good points you guys made. The timeline thing is helpful because it creates an accountability moment, right? So if there's no timeline, there's no reason for people in the U.S. government to look at anything on the calendar and think, oh, we better have a process to at least answer the question, right? And so saying 2024 as a timeline at least kind of forces some issue where if you either meet that timeline or there's some accountability for not meeting it. And and to Rachel's point, like, as bad as it would be, let's say hypothetically they met that timeline, from an optimistic perspective. Even if you had another administration say, well, we're not going to abide by that, the U.S. military will have adjusted to the new reality. And it's very unlikely that the U.S. military as an institution is going to be like, okay, now just because, some anti-international, whatever, multilateral constraints administration came in, says you can use these weapons again, it's very unlikely that the U.S. military is going to go back and try to buy a bunch of landmines and rewrite war plans to use them, right? And so if you can get there, you can kind of de facto solve the problem.
And I will just put a quick exclamation point on the 2024 timeline. Speaking of congressional champions, as Ben brought up earlier, in 2020, Senator Leahy and Chairman McGovern organized a fantastic letter to President Biden, signed by over a dozen senators and representatives. It was bipartisan, and they put the deadline of 2024 in their letter as well. So I think we've come to a consensus. We've set the timeline for the Biden administration on today's call. But having those congressional allies keep that pressure up as well can be so important. We did have another question in the chat from Tracy. What do we know of the possible alternatives for the defense of the Republic of Korea that does not involve APLs that the U.S. said in their fact sheet as so important? And anyone that would like to answer that?
It's like looking for unicorns, they don't exist. They're right in front of you. They are the weapons that the United States already has in its arsenal, and that's a considerable depth and breadth of types of weapons. It's been really disappointing for me to see the United States sink probably as much money. Well, no, actually, we put it in our press release, about $1 billion the United States has spent seeking alternatives to anti-personnel landmines over the years. And that's funded a lot of research and development efforts. And it has seen some more sophisticated remote control devices. The treaty prohibits victim-activated landmines. It doesn't prohibit the ones that are remotely controlled by a human soldier, a human operator. But it's not just the weapon themselves, it's the tactics, it's the doctrine, it's a whole host of different things in there. The last policy announcement in 2014 had some kind of high fidelity modeling study or something that the Pentagon was supposed to conclude. I don't even know if that ever happened. It was the officials had such a hard time even describing what it was. But this one really does seem to be quite clear that the exception is Korea. The exception is not different types of landmines, or it's not dependent on finding this magical alternative.
Thanks.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add to that. Oh, so go ahead.
No, you're okay. I just want to invite Mike into the conversation.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a huge arms race going on right now in Asia, in Southeast Asia, between the two Koreas, Japan, China, everyone down there. The U.S. is involved with that, probably Russia. Defense of the line, I think the thinking is so old there to say we've got to somehow stop them at the line. That's not going to happen anyway, because you're not going to see massive forces coming and stepping on landmines. there'll be technology used to fight a war there, which is a little scary in itself. But landmines, I think it's been pointed out over and over again, are really outdated as a weapons use that's effective. The cluster bomb question is a lot more indiscriminate, but I think the defense of the Korean Peninsula is going to be based more on strategic application of weapons from ships and distances, which the North Koreans are building up and trying to demonstrate that they have the capacity to do. And I do think a conversation with the South Korean government about all of this if it's not going on, should be going on.
Thanks. And Ben?
You know, I was going to say something quite similar. I mean, there's a piece of you know, and without getting into anything, there's nothing sensitive, but like, you know, there's a piece of the thinking that is around slowing an initial advance that doesn't take into account the shift in warfare itself since those plans were made. And the reality is that the United States would be able to bring such overwhelming conventional military force in the early moments of a Korean Peninsula conflict, absent landmines, that it doesn't make a ton of sense what, and frankly, the nightmare scenario obviously is now you have the introduction of unconventional nuclear weapons, but it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the United States would be relying on landmines to slow a North Korean ground invasion versus deploying an overwhelming amount of conventional firepower from the sea, from the air, and from artillery that would necessitate it. I don't claim to be like a military expert in that regard, but there's a common sense piece to this, you know?
Yeah. So thanks so much. We just have a few minutes left in today's webinar, and I know we have some of our colleagues from Congress on the call. So I did want to open it up. You know, Congress has been really great at appropriating funds for UXO clearance over the last several years, but what more can Congress be doing on these issues? Anyone?
I'd say quickly on that, and I want to thank and I want to note the incredible congressional support for UXO clearance. And we got the initial tranche of UXO clearance funding for Laos in the Obama years. If you told me that funding would increase through the Trump years, I don't know if I would have placed that bet, but that just speaks to the congressional support, bipartisan congressional support. I think one thing is just to take this Korean example, ask the questions, right? The oversight capacity of Congress to go to DOD and press them on alternatives to landmines or press them on why they need this exception. Congress has a capacity to ask and get answers to questions that nobody else does. And I think that's an important place to focus.
And Mary, it looked like you had an answer as well.
Not really. I mean, I think it's real kind of transitional moment with Senator Leahy retiring this year, and we need to acknowledge all that he's done getting this all off the ground back in 1991, you know, passing the very first export ban on anti-personnel landmines with 100% of the Senate voting with him on that. And this is, I think, one reason why the Biden administration has carried this forward relatively quickly is that personal friendship with Leahy and all of their history of votes and of legislative efforts on this. So transparency is a really big one. And, you know, we've come so far on landmine policy, and yet on cluster munitions, we're way back. The United States government officials rarely even acknowledge the existence of that convention on cluster munitions, let alone come and participate as an observer. And I think more questions from Congress on cluster munitions would be very helpful as well at this time.
Thank you. Thank you both. With just a few minutes left and no further questions from the audience that I'm seeing, I did just want to give everyone one last minute if there's anything you wish you had said. I will start with you, Rachel. Any closing thoughts?
Thanks, Ursula. I do think, you know, this is an important moment, right? This is one of the first reviews that we've seen the Biden administration complete in the conventional weapons space that have been promised over the past year and a half. And I hope it bodes well for future reviews of other systems and other policies that the administration is undertaking. But I don't think we should lose sight of really how important this policy change is, and that there still is a lot of work to do, but let's take a moment to just acknowledge and celebrate, given how hard it is to have successes in this space so often, but that this is a good thing, what we've seen happen today. It doesn't mean we're going to let up. It doesn't mean we're not going to keep pushing and keep working. But hopefully, you know, in the next 2 years, because now I've adopted 2024 is it, you know, in the next 2 years, we'll see continued evolution of U.S. anti-personnel landmines policy, but also of our cluster munitions policy.
Thank you. And Mary?
I think Rachel did a really good job on that recap here. I was thinking about something I didn't say on production, which is, you know, in China and Russia, it's state-owned manufacturers who are making these prohibited weapons, not so much private companies. And that goes back to what kind of country we live in the United States, and that we have freedoms, and that we have oversight in that, you know, there is the possibility to step in and regulate. So we need to use that power that we have as citizens, and we also need to act in solidarity with survivors of landmines and cluster munitions around the world, in acknowledgement of the legacy of harm that the United States played its part in creating by manufacturing and exporting landmines and cluster munitions in such vast numbers around the world for so many decades. We're on the right path on both now. But that's the burden that the United States must carry and must continue to address.
Thank you. And Ben?
Yeah, I'd just say this is a great conversation. On the China and Russia point, one of the things that can happen when you have outliers to rules-based international solutions is the fact that the outliers can become a justification for the United States not tying its own hands. But I would argue that it's actually the opposite, that if we are in this so-called struggle between democracies and autocracies, you know, which the US engages in imperfectly, obviously, better to try to demonstrate through your own leadership what is the rules-based order look like. You know, someone here, you know, killer robots is another one. It's a whole other question. But I think that it's all the more important that the U.S. model what responsible international action in warfare looks like at a time when you have particularly Russia moving to be more of an outlier. And I do just want to second, like, none of this progress has been made happens without people like Mike. I mean, the power of the voice of veterans of the wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. I saw firsthand that capacity to mobilize pretty enormous resources in ways that just wouldn't happen otherwise. And same, obviously, with Buntan, like the stories of what happens to human beings similarly is essential to this. So obviously that's the moral authority that informs all of this.
Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, I heard it said that we do this because it's the right thing to do. And I think we should never forget that, because that is the bottom line for it. I've also heard words about it takes courage to take positions. I've heard that the United States should try to position itself as the leader and not the outlier. And I think the opportunity to do that right now is very clear. I want to thank Senator Leahy particularly, and President Obama, who in the last few years, before the last 4 years, were making progress, and Senator Leahy continues to do that. And even though he's retiring, he's to be thanked for having drawn so much attention to and been able to find the funding to try to fix some of these ugly problems. He'll be missed. We have Senator Baldwin and some others stepping up now, but they need to know they've got people behind them. They need to know that there are all of us out here who will stand up and voice our views on the stupidity of war, but particularly the stupidity of some of the weapons. That has to translate into our policies and our military defense sense, which I think is a doable thing. Ben is absolutely right. We got to get down to the Pentagon somehow and tell them, hey, it's time to catch up. And Congress can ask those questions. They can put the DOD on the hot seat, say, where are you on these things? Are you really moderate? The indiscriminate use of some of our weapons in the past needs to stop. And I think that puts the United States in a much stronger position to be the shining light on the hill again, to say, look, we practice what we preach, and we will deal with this with all of our constituents and all of our constituencies. So thanks to all of you, and thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. And for the last word, before I pass it to Jeff to close, Bhutan, if there's anything else you would like to share.
Thank you for having me on again. I know for a fact that the UXO landmines and other explosive devices in Laos impacts all aspects of life, and an estimate of 80 million bombs did not detonated on impact, littering about 1/3 of the country. So there are so many work that we can, it can be done, or with all of us, and the administration and the higher administration can get all this work done. And the good news is there are people who are working tirelessly to remove the bombs, but they need to help us to ensure the funding, again, funding, and perhaps, the expertise that can help us to remove the landmines from the Southeast Asia. And that's all I need to say. And then I know that there's a funding to Laos, and then in Vietnam and Cambodia. I thank you for that, and we appreciate, and on behalf of the Lao people in the Southeast Asia, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, I would like to thank all of you and all the committees that are working on this tirelessly.
Thank you so much. And thank you all panelists for sharing your expertise, for sharing your stories, for sharing your experiences today. And I'm just going to pass the mic to Jeff Meir to close us out.
Thank you, Ursula. And again, the U.S. campaign to ban landmines, the U.S. Cluster Munition Coalition would like to really thank Bhutan, Mike, Mary, Rachel, and Ben for your exceptional testimony and really insightful analysis about this old but new problem. Also want to take a moment to thank Alexandra Grossi, who is the coordinator for the campaigns. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help put this event together, and we're very, very grateful for your efforts on this and many, many other things. And especially want to thank Ursula Knudsen-Lata, who had the idea for this event in the first place and who really executed it, I think, brilliantly and with tremendous effectiveness. So thank you tremendously to Ursula and her colleagues at FCNL. But most of all, I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today for this, seemingly timeless question. And if there's one thing to leave you with, it is that while many people have thought about this issue for a long, long time, there's no time like the present. This is the moment to speak with your members. This is the moment to speak with senators. This is the time to ask them how they feel about this issue and whether we can make a difference right now and end this problem once and for all. So again, on behalf of all of us at the campaigns, we thank you for your participation and enjoy the rest of your day.